When I first met Nikki, I just saw this beautiful woman with these great big brown gorgeous eyes. She was coming home from work and I put a lot of candles out in the lounge. She came in and I got down on my knees and said, "I love you, will you marry me?"
This is Nikki Metta's big day. The vivacious 34-year-old is getting married to Nicholas Tegg. He's the nervous-looking one waiting in Coventry Registry Office. They're one of thousands of mixed-race couples who get married each year.
He's definitely my soulmate. I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with him.
I'm here because this wedding symbolises one of the truly great changes in British life. Once, and it's not so long ago, such a relationship would leave you ostracised and officially condemned.
It now gives me the greatest of pleasure to announce that you are husband and wife. Would you like to seal it with a kiss? Congratulations.
British marriages are changing. They're no longer about bringing two people together. Quite often it's a mingling of two cultures. The in-laws haven't just come from another part of the country. Quite often they might have started their journey in another part of the world.
100 years ago, it took far less than a marriage to have the fingers wagging.
If you danced with a black man, you were discriminated against because the people didn't like it. The boys didn't like it, the girls didn't like it.
They came to the front door and they're saying, "Where is he? Where is the nigger?" And she said, "He's not here." And so they slapped my grandmother.
Yet, through it all, mixed-race communities have not just survived, they've flourished.
We'd seen half of the picture of Shirley Temple, but we had to race home on account of curfew.
Well, they measured our heads and like that, and colour of eyes, and noted our complexion.
The Britain we have today, vibrant and mixed, would not have been possible were it not for the brave couples who fell in love in a much colder racial climate.
I stopped and asked this boy then the way to Queen Street, and he said I was losing my way to the docks. And we started talking. I think we fell in love there and then.
1 in 10 children in this country now lives in a mixed-race family, and mixed-race people are becoming one of the fastest-growing ethnic minorities. Born in Sri Lanka, I met and married an Englishwoman. This is our story, but it's also the history of our country.
Francis and I met at university, and that was what? Well, over 30 years ago. And I'm not sure that we ever talked about colour or anything like that. I think when we got married, we were aware of a sort of meeting of cultures. You can see that in the wedding photos. We've got 2 sons, Adam and Matthew.
The recent history of mixed-race Britain starts in port towns like this one in South Shields. True, there were Africans in Britain since the time of the Romans. Asians settled on these shores in the 1600s, and of course there were freed slaves. But it's not really till the turn of the last century that mixed-race communities, small as they were, began to shape our collective history. Trade was the great magnetic force, a booming economy based on coal and ships sucked in workers from the empire. Our ports, London, Liverpool, Cardiff and others, resounded with foreign tongues. In South Shields there were Arab seamen from Aden, today's Yemen, recruited by the Merchant Navy. As residents of the British Empire and its protectorates, they were entitled to work here. They would spend months at sea stoking the fires of commerce around the world. When they came ashore, these men were put into lodgings run by the private shipping companies.
In 1909, some of the men lived here in the Leygate district in what were then boarding houses. It wasn't that they wanted to live separately, they didn't really have a choice. The seamen weren't actually allowed to stay with local families.
The reason? The age-old fear that this army of single men thousands of miles away from their families would look for company and more among the local women. This is one of the last boarding houses that remain in South Shields. Friends still meet to talk over the old days.
When we come in here, from High Shields, we was bridge, there, bridge.
A bridge from High Shields, yeah.
They all back and front, the all houses, Arab houses, and all cafe, boarding house. You feel, when you hear the record, Arab record, you feel you were in Yemen.
If they didn't have their own house or they weren't married, it was like a bed and breakfast, if you like. Yeah. So they used to call them boarding houses or the Arab cafes, and people used to meet there as well. It wasn't just a bed and breakfast, it was like a little community cafe as well.
You have to remember though, they weren't allowed to go in English cafes when they came here. No.
When they first came.
They couldn't go into it there, they couldn't go into a tea shop. So they had to set their own place up where they could meet.
For years, these segregated groups of foreign workers were too small to have any great impact, but that would change. When Britain went to war in 1914, it needed sailors, lots of them, to work on its merchant ships. The Empire was the obvious labour pool. With German U-boats picking off our ships, threatening Britain's supply chain, these men played a vital part in the war effort.
They're growing in numbers. Some of them also come and work in factories, but they're arriving in ports like London, like Cardiff, like Liverpool. And they increase from a few hundred to a few thousand.
It became ever more difficult to prevent social mingling, and British women, who'd played their part in the war effort, no longer fitted the demure stereotype.
I think it transformed women's lives because they had to take on jobs that had been designated men's jobs. Women across the class, from upper class women who, previously had been chaperoned everywhere, the younger women, through to working class women, took on all sorts of work. They were tram drivers, they were road sweepers. They went out and about, they went to pubs, they went to the cinema. They learned a lot about, not just about themselves, they learned about sexuality, they learned about birth control, about things that were previously taboo for many of these women.
And then their relationships start happening between these foreign men and the white women. Why is that?
Well, the white women haven't got the usual white men to have relations with, and I think they find a lot of these black and Asian and Chinese men very attractive, not least because they're different. They often are very generous with money. Some of them, come on shore with money to burn and are kind of kind. A lot of them talk about how kind these men are relative to the men they're used to. And so they start having relationships with them.
So by the end of the war, many of these men decide to stay. In ports, you see the beginnings of mixed-race communities, no longer isolated individuals, but families with local roots. There were now perhaps 20,000 men from the Caribbean, the Middle East and Asia here. Imagine what it was like for the Tommies returning home. They found new neighbours, things seemed strange, including the women they'd left behind.
The divorce rate, it goes up from fivefold from 1913 to 1919. They just find they're not speaking the same language. And so they feel the gulf that actually these women are kind of alien. And the women, I think, resent the men, resent the fact that they want to go back to some status quo pre-war in which they got to be the good little woman in the home or whatever. And so they, say no.
You couldn't turn the clock back. Jobs are scarce. These war-weary men are bristling with resentment, and then they see their women with foreigners. It's enough to tip them over the edge. In 1919, rioting broke out in the port areas around Glasgow and spread to South Shields.
You've got to imagine hundreds of seamen here on the dockside at Mill Dam, the whites easily outnumbering the Arabs. Both sides had guns, bottles, knives and stones. Most of the firing was into the air. Nobody actually got shot, but both groups threw their missiles at each other. A local woman called Dora Sharp, who worked in one of the boarding houses, was a witness to the violence. In court, she spoke up for some of the Yemenis, saying she'd seen a white man pointing a gun at an Arab in the heat of the riot. Magnificently, she declared, "I wouldn't leave the Arab house for 20 of you. I'm probably going to marry one of them tomorrow." Happy days.
The riots spread to Cardiff, another port city that had changed. Before the war, there'd been about 700 foreign seamen in the city. By 1919, there were 3,000. One summer's evening, a group of these foreign men and their white girlfriends were travelling home after a day out. It was like a challenge to local masculinity. White men threw insults and then stones. It was the spark that lit the Cardiff tinderbox. Within hours, violent disorder spread across the city. The white mob split up into gangs and roamed the city, attacking black and Arab men, even their white girlfriends and wives.
On the day of the riot, one of the neighbours ran to the front door and knocked the door and said, "You better get Joe out of there because they're coming to get him."
Neil Sinclair's grandmother was Agnes Jolly. She lived in Somerset Street with her West Indian husband, Joe Headley, and their 8-year-old daughter, Beatrice, who passed the story on to her son, Neil.
My grandfather didn't want to leave the house and leave his wife and his child alone, but Agnes Jolly said, "No, they're after you, so you get out." So he went out the back, climbed over the back garden wall and hid in the toilet next door. Apparently there was 1,000 white men in the street. They came to the front door and they started banging on the front door, so my grandmother and my mother went upstairs to the landing and they could see the shadows and lights as men broke into the front door, and then men just ran into the downstairs and into every room and started to ransack the home. So eventually they got up to my grandmother and was saying, "Where is he? Where is the nigger?" And she said, "He's not here." And so they slapped my grandmother. They left, and then my mother said her mother was very distraught because all her little china ornaments and her knickknacks in her cosy little home had been wrecked. Police came the following day and they said to my grandmother, well, it was her fault for marrying a black man.
It's impossible to be certain, but something like 15,000 people were involved in the riots in 1919. And they affected not just South Shields and Cardiff, but London, Barry, Newport and Hull. In all, 5 people were killed, and they've gone down as a landmark in the history of mixed-race Britain. You see, whatever the wider social and economic problems of the time, it was a sight of foreign men with white women that lit the fuse. A letter appeared in the Times shortly afterwards. Just listen to this. "Intimate association between black or coloured men and white women is a thing of horror. It's an instinctive certainty that sexual relations between white women and coloured men revolt our very nature. What blame," it goes on to say, "to those white men who, seeing these conditions and loathing them, resort to violence."
I think there was deep resentment, and they felt not simply that these men were taking their women, but they were taking their jobs, although in fact that wasn't true. Actually, after the war there was higher unemployment amongst black men and Chinese men than these white men. So sort of the definers of working class masculinity, which I think, linked to the ability to get a job, the ability to get a woman, that is really being challenged.
In direct response to the riots, the authorities resorted to some stringent legal measures. Laws designed to restrict German nationals during the war now covered all foreign seamen. It would limit their movement, subject them to curfew, control employment, and last for decades. In short, the foreigners were blamed.
You have to understand, in those days, it must have been hard for the British to accept,
I mean,
mixed
like
marriages.
they used to say foreign devils in those days, because they didn't understand Chinese ways and Chinese customs. Just a foreigner come to England to live.
Doreen and Lynn's father, Stanley R. Fu, came to Liverpool back in 1912. Back then, there were roughly 1,200 Chinese men in the city. He fell in love with and married their mother, Emily. Stanley's job on the steamships took him away for long periods of time, but when he returned, he was king of the kitchen.
Dad was a marvellous cook.
Yeah, he was a good cook.
And it was lovely when he came home because we had the Chinese food. Although my mother learned to cook Chinese. Yeah, but my dad was special, his cooking was really good.
Doreen, when he was back home, what was he like?
He's always cracking, he's always playing tricks on us.
Yeah, he was quite jolly, very jolly, and, he'd sort of flick your hair when you walking past, and, he'd jump out, and we'd have real fun with him, yeah.
Is that your memory of childhood then?
Happy, yeah.
It was a very happy childhood.
Oh, yeah, it was lovely.
Their carefree home life was a contrast to the restrictions that Stanley faced when he stepped outdoors. Ever since the 1919 riots, Stanley, like all foreign seamen, had to register with the police and carry an ID card bearing a photograph. Even Emily was not immune from this humiliation. An earlier nationality law had a rather vicious sting in its tail. Every inch an Englishwoman, once she'd married Stanley, she lost her British nationality.
Well, when my mum married my dad, she became an alien.
Your mum, who was British?
Yes, she was an alien because she...
Is a book which will tell you. That's my mum's book, because once she married my father, she was an alien.
Looking back at the thought of your mum, British born and bred, having to go and register, what do you think of it now?
Well, I think it was disgusting, really. She was born and bred in England. She was English, white. Yeah. So why should she, because she married an alien, have to give up everything?
Yeah.
The law was applied differently around the country. Liverpool had a curfew and men had to report to the police every week. Incredibly, these restrictions remained on the statute books until the 1970s. Doreen and Lynn remember the day when even watching a film was interrupted by the curfew.
We'd gone before the curfew and we'd seen half of the picture of Shirley Temple, and they suddenly realised, my dad and his friends, well, it's 8 o'clock, we'll have to go now, It was disappointing because we didn't see the end of the film, but we had to race home.
Despite the rules and regulations, mixed communities in port towns were still growing. The Yemeni enclave in South Shields, for example, was about 3,000 strong. Norman and Maureen Kader have been married for 37 years. They're both second-generation mixed-race Yemenis, though you'd be hard-pushed to tell in Maureen's case. Both have Yemeni grandfathers who came to South Shields. Maureen remembers how hard the Yemeni men tried to fit in.
I know when they came here, they were very smart. When they changed clothes, they had to be very, very smart. They wanted to try and be like the English people. They wanted to blend in. You always seen them in a trilby hat, lovely immaculate shoes, waistcoats. So, and it was all to help them to blend in so that they didn't stand out. And they were always very, very well mannered.
One of these men was Norman's grandfather, Mohammed Hassan. He married Elizabeth Taylor, a Geordie. Their love affair was all the more incredible given what was happening around them.
It would have been very difficult for them because if you were in a mixed marriage, you were called some dreadful names. You were classed as a prostitute, and women were known to have been spat on in the street and verbally abused.
The white women?
Yes.
South Shields was by no means unique. Prejudice towards mixed-race families was pervasive. In London's Docklands, home to 700 Chinese people, intolerance coupled with ignorance made for some dark myths about the community. Connie grew up in London's Limehouse, the capital's original Chinatown.
If you look at the literature of the time, they talk about Chinatown and it was an opium den and there were nightclubs and there were strange things going on. You're laughing at me.
Well, I used to read these rubbishy books when I was in my teens, and I used to go to piano lessons, and I used to have to walk down these narrow turnings, and I used to look for the mist rising from the river and these earthy people standing in the doorways, but I never ever found them.
It was all fiction, was it?
Yes, yes, yes.
But it must have been weird as a teenager growing up in Chinatown, reading these books about starlets coming and the kind of drugs and so on.
Yes.
But you're saying it just didn't happen like that?
No, we were just ordinary kids looking for a job after we left school, going to work, coming home.
No matter, Chinatown still attracted those with a taste for the illicit, the opium dens and gaming houses, whether real or imagined. Writers and filmmakers made for Chinatown, drawn to the exotic and forbidden possibilities of this place. In 1919, the American film director D.W. Griffith's interest was aroused after reading a story, The Chink and the Child, taken from Thomas Burke's book Limehouse Nights. This tale of love between an opium-smoking Chinaman and a teenage white girl was initially banned by libraries. W.H. Smith refused to stock it because they felt it was salacious and corrupting. In his film version, Broken Blossoms, Griffiths had to work around the unwritten rule that there could never be any kind of physical intimacy between the races.
When the film was released here in 1920, the Birmingham Mail received a letter from a female reader in Edgbaston, written, it said, on behalf of herself and her friends. She described the film as nothing but the lowest type of sordid drama, and she was particularly horrified that the hero of the film was a Chinaman and the villain an Englishman.
But two white women married to Chinese men wrote to the Daily Graphic, challenging this type of prejudice. We women dare not take our children out because people point to us and laugh. And please remember these half-castes, as they call them, are well-fed, well-clothed little kiddies who are as good as most and better than many of the children about here.
This film, Broken Blossom, painted quite a kind relationship between a Chinese man and a white, well, very young woman. Was that real, do you think?
Yes, but it was quite normal in Limehouse.
You didn't think it was strange? You didn't think it was controversial at all?
No. I think the Chinese, that they like the British way of life.
In 1924, there were signs that official attitudes towards the Chinese were hardening. They were added to a list of nationalities to be avoided by potential brides. Marriage registrars were supposed to warn women that some of the men might be bigamists and not trustworthy. The original list, drawn up in 1913 by the Colonial Office, already included Hindus, Muslims and Negroes.
And pretty soon the Home Office would join in, complaining that the Chinese men were being far too choosy. Just listen to this. It's such a pity that a Chinaman is fastidious. He will not take a battered old prostitute of the seaport, but wants something young, attractive, above all clean and free from venereal disease. Now, even if you allow for the stilted official language of the day, it's still pretty shocking, isn't it?
All this in an age of inventiveness. The wireless and the flying machine, with their potential for shrinking the world, were breaking through old boundaries. Science seemed to have the answer to all questions, even about race. Before long, the thoroughly scientific-sounding British Eugenics Society developed a controversial theory. It ran like this: if the poorest classes could be discouraged from breeding, the sum total of intelligence and virtue in the country would increase.
Eugenics saw itself as a new science for human advancement. Influential writers like H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, cabinet ministers like Winston Churchill, they all thought it would save Britain from moral and physical decline. There were similar movements in America and Scandinavia. And in Germany, there was the charmingly named Racial Hygiene Society.
At a meeting in London in 1919, the chairman of the British Society, Leonard Darwin, son of Charles, announced that they would also look at race. What is urgently needed, he said, is a thorough scientific study of the mental and physical characteristics of mixed races.
Mrs. Sybil Gotto, the Society's General Secretary at the time, agreed, saying, "Although I'm quite ready to look upon the coloured races as our brothers, I do not want to look upon them as our brothers-in-law."
The inference, of course, was that they were inferior. If they were proved right, the logical conclusion would have been for Britain to introduce laws banning mixed-race relationships, following where others had led. Some American states had laws dating back to 1661, preventing whites marrying Native Americans and African Americans. In southern Rhodesia, a law was passed in 1903 that made it an offence to have sex outside of marriage between native males and white females. And in Australia, the state had recently begun a policy of removing so-called half-castes from their parents to imbue them with European values and, I quote, breed out their colour.
Many of them are half Japanese, daughters of pearl fishing fathers and Aboriginal mothers. Many again are almost white.
So the British Eugenics Society decided to investigate families of what they called mated Chinese and English or Irish and mixed-race children with black fathers to test the theory that racial mixing led to inferior stock. The unfortunate mixed-race children of Liverpool would be the first guinea pigs on which the theory would be tested.
Eugenics seeks to apply the known laws of heredity so as to prevent the degeneration of the race and improve its inborn qualities. Everybody sound in body and mind should marry and have enough children to perpetuate their stock and carry on the race.
Just listen to the language they use. They talked of mated and stock, the kind of word you'd use to describe animals.
The survey comprised just 15 families and 45 children. At its head, a Welsh anthropologist, Professor Herbert John Fleur.
Along with his colleague Rachel Fleming, he began to measure the shape and size of the children's heads, their noses, their ears, even the fold on their upper eyelids. They made careful notes of the colour of the skin, the hair, and the eyes. They were being treated as if they were some kind of exotic specimen. In fact, they were boys and girls, sons and daughters, all of them rooted here in the local community.
This is a period when many people, including scientists, geneticists, etc., believed that interracial relations between races, and I'm using some inverted commas, who were deemed to be very far apart was kind of detrimental. That would lead to degeneracy.
Isn't this weird, actually? I mean, this is a bit of an aside, but I come from a mixed-race family, and we look at our kids and think, wow, you know, this kind of mixture.
Absolutely, yes.
You know,
it's yes,
beautiful and it's energetic and flamboyant.
Exactly.
But they thought exactly the opposite.
Exactly, yes. And they felt it would lead... this word degeneracy was very widespread at the time, and they felt this meant that the population would be full of these peoples who would be inferior in every sense.
The eugenicists' methods made for some pretty crude science. They tested children to see if there was a relationship between physical appearance and intellect. Eventually, the tests were carried out in Limehouse, and 9-year-old Connie and her friends were the subjects there.
There was a big restaurant in West India Dock Road that had rooms upstairs. We were told to go to this room, and there was these ladies. They just measured us and took our photographs. And I think they asked us questions, I'm not quite sure.
When you say measured you, what did they actually do?
Yeah, so they measured our heads and like that, and colour of eyes, and noted our complexion and that sort of thing.
When the results were published, the sample included the children of black fathers. Professor Fleur was in for a surprise, perhaps even disappointment.
Did the results support their basic idea that this was a bad thing to have mixed-race relationships?
No, interestingly, so-called yellow-white hybrids produced kids of higher intelligence. And so, I think a lot of people...
That was a bit of a shock.
But the black-white hybrids, they said, well, they were problematic because they said that the children inherited the worst of both. They inherited happy-go-lucky, carefree, lazy, and these are all terms they use, attitude of the black father, and the slovenly, immoralness, because it was assumed the women must be akin to prostitutes, if not actual prostitutes.
They also came to another conclusion about mixed-race children.
They wanted to see to what degree they could pass as English, but the implication was that none of these children could ever be English. In the first case, they didn't look English, but also, even if they could pass, that had the implication, and there might be a 2% that could pass, but of course, given that their parentage was not English, their father's not English, they could never truly be English.
And if that flirtation with science didn't come up with all the answers they expected, there was still good, old-fashioned prejudice. You could depend on that. Even the civil service was not immune. You'd search in vain for its renowned detachment when it came to some matters of race.
A memo in 1925 from the Home Office to the Foreign Office summed up the feelings. The Negro is said to be more largely developed than the white man, and a woman who's once been with a Negro is said to find no satisfaction with anything else. And those already inclined to resentment were goaded on by some newspapers. One of them reported that certain white women here in the district were saying that black men were better at sex than whites.
As it happened, one group of white women seemed determined to prove the civil servants and newspapers right. The genie of interracial relations was well and truly out of the bottle, and as the 20s roared on, it was the upper classes leading the way. In 1928, Nancy Cunard, the writer and heir to the cruise line, was scandalising high society with her relationships with black men. At one lunch party, Margot Asquith, the wife of the former Liberal Prime Minister Henry, is said to have greeted Nancy's mother with the words, "Well, Maud, what's Nancy up to now? Is it dope, drink or niggers?" And it worked the other way too. In 1930, this mosque in Woking, Surrey, was where one of the richest men on earth, the Sultan of Johore, married a Scottish divorcee. She was the latest in a long string of wives. Incredibly, the mosque had been built in the 1800s and was patronised by British aristocrats who'd converted to Islam. It was the venue for marriages between upper and middle-class white women and Asian or Arab men. Shortly after the ceremony here, the Sultan and his latest wife, Helen Wilson, travelled to Johore in Malaysia, where she was crowned Sultana. The world's press fawned over the Sultan, even when he ditched the unfortunate Helen for someone new. Upper-class license and foreign wealth seemed to free them of the social taboos. There were limits, though.
I cannot speak enough of this content. It stops me here. It is too much of joy. And this, the greatest discords be that e'er our hearts shall make.
On the 19th of May 1930, on this very stage, Paul Robeson, the African-American singer and actor, came to play Othello here in Britain.
If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, for I fear my soul hath a content so absolute, that not another comfort like to this succeeds in unknown.
And who was his Desdemona? Well, she was a rather sheltered, middle-class 23-year-old, and her name was Peggy Ashcroft.
That song tonight will not go from my mind. I have much to do but to go hang my head all at one side and sing it like poor Barbara.
In rehearsals, fear of the public's reaction had made Robeson uncomfortable. After all, his father had been a slave. "That girl couldn't get near to me," he said later. "I was backing away from her all the time. I was like a plantation hand in the parlour, that clumsy."
Well, on that opening night, Peggy Ashcroft got rave reviews, and the audience, well, they were just ecstatic, giving Paul Robeson no less than 20 curtain calls. But the sight of a black actor actually kissing a white woman, well, that was rather too much for one newspaper editor. He just walked out.
Robeson himself told the New York Times, "I wouldn't care to play those scenes in some parts of the United States. The audience would get rough. In fact, it might become very dangerous." One Southern paper agreed. He knows what would happen, and so do the rest of us.
And who knows what would have happened here if they knew what was actually going on off stage between Othello and his Desdemona.
What the press and public didn't know was just how close the pair had become. 50 years later, Peggy Ashcroft said that what happened between Paul and myself was possibly inevitable. How could one not fall in love with such a man? The whole episode was, she said, more than a theatrical experience. It put the significance of race straight in front of me and made my choice of where I stood. miles away in Cardiff, some had already made their choice. Racial mingling, as some called it, was growing. By the mid-30s, Tiger Bay was home to about 3,000 foreign seamen, mainly Africans and Arabs. Many of them had been born and bred in Cardiff, but were still treated as foreigners. Nonetheless, they and their descendants would go on to create one of the country's most proudly mixed communities.
My dad had just opened up the Cairo Caf, not long, and he happened to be standing outside on the front door in Bute Street. And my mother, she was a nurse at the time, she'd been to the cinema, and she was trying to get back to the Cardiff Royal Infirmary, where she lived. You know, the accommodation was there.
Olive Salomon was 15 years old when she moved from the small town of Penadraig in the Rhondda Valley to Cardiff to train as a nurse.
I stopped and asked this boy then the way to Queen Street, and he said I was losing my way to the docks. And we started talking. I think we fell in love there and then.
The boy she met and asked for directions was Ali Salomon, a young Yemeni working as a chef in his own cafe.
We got married when I was 16 and 3 weeks, actually. I had 5 children before I was 21. We had 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls. Of course, when I got married, there was a great stir at home because the priest from the church even came and told my mother that marrying an Arab, I was marrying a heathen, and there was quite a stir at home.
I used to go in the Cairo Cafe, and in the back of the Cairo Cafe they had a little Arab school. And I used to go to the Arab school, and many of the kids used to go to the Arab school, even though we weren't Arabs or Muslims for that matter. But because your friends were going, you wanted to go along. But we were like a very integrated community.
What's that? Ta. 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 Ti كثرة. Ta الساكن. يا الله.
Tiger Bay was home to many different races. They all came together, though, to celebrate festivals like Eid, the end of Ramadan.
You'd wake up and you might hear a sound. Hillalawiyah, hillalawiyah. And you go, oh, it's Arab Christmas. So you ran out there and you looked for your friends and all of the people of the Arab community, and they'd be in their native dress, and they'd parade in the street with flags and what have you, and we'd follow along in the parade. We'd be all part of it. Then when it came to the food, they would offer you the food, or you could run home and actually get a pot, and you'd get curry and rice, and you'd be able to take it home.
Britain's mixed-race families were sharing each other's customs and making their own rules. It was genuinely multicultural, though that's not what people called it then. It was like that for Norman Cader's mother, Margaret, in South Shields, who was married to a Yemeni seaman, Abdo.
My mother, she wasn't a full practicing Muslim, if you like. She still held a lot of the beliefs.
So would your mother have run the house as if it were a Muslim house, as far as, for example, eating pork and that kind of thing?
There is, my father never ever ate pork. My mother, on the other hand, to a certain degree.
Why are you giggling? Why are you giggling away? There's a little secret going on here.
The English women would eat pork when the husbands were out.
When they were out at sea or something?
No, when they actually left the house.
Oh, really?
For me, it was different because my mum would eat what she wanted. So we had a separate frying pan, which she had to keep in a separate cupboard from my father. You know, you couldn't use that, and he knew that. And he would often swear in Arabic if he had seen the frying pan out, you know, because she'd been cooking bacon and that. But a lot, the same as what Norman's mum did.
But your mum was doing it in secret?
Yes.
These couples were making it up as they went along, sharing some customs and quietly ignoring those that didn't work for them. It was, if you like, a delightful free-for-all, and that just didn't suit some people. In Cardiff, one man, above all, wanted to put a stop to this sweet chaos.
The city's chief constable, one James Wilson, was becoming increasingly concerned about Tiger Bay's reputation for immorality and mixed-race marriages, and he reported his worries to his local police committee, saying that coloured men were coming into contact with the female sex of the white race. Their progeny, he said, were half-caste, with the vicious hereditary taint of their parents. Not one to pull his punches.
The picture the chief constable painted of the area was very different from the reality.
It had a bit of a reputation because there was a lot of street gambling used to go on, and being a port, there was prostitution and that. But the actual people from Butone, they were the nicest people you could ever come across. When the Cairo Caf was in its heyday, we employed a lot of the women that lived down in the bay. They came to work in the Cairo Caf, and some of them would be babysitting us as we were youngsters and whatnot. My mother was also, believe it or not, chairman of the Conservative Club in the Docks, which caused great problems amongst the community.
In 1929, James Wilson started to call openly for a new form of social control, anti-miscegenation laws similar to those which had been introduced in South Africa, banning sexual contact between whites and non-whites. He was playing the race card, and he put all his cards on the table.
The time may come, said the chief constable, when public opinion will awake to the fact that our race has become leavened with the colour strain. Someone, he said, must have the courage to strike a warning note, and he clearly thought of himself as the man to do it, the defender of the white race. The issue erupted onto the front pages, and many journalists actually supported the chief constable, with one of them writing, "I feel that in the interest of our town's purity, it would be a good thing if our swarthy friends were given the order of the boot."
For the mixed-race communities, it was an explicit attack on their families and their whole way of life.
The newspapers would say things that this promiscuity between blacks and white, and obviously the white women could not be women of good repute. They had to be women of ill repute. They had to be prostitutes or immoral women, which was quite untrue of my grandmothers and many of the matriarchs of the old Tiger Bay community, who made us go to Sunday school, made us go to church, dress up on Sunday and so on, and visit all our aunties and uncles. They were normal families.
In the end, Britain avoided the kind of draconian measures the chief constable had in mind. Calmer heads recognised that a law banning sex between races would be impossible to enforce, and ironically the prospect of an angry reaction in the Empire, those lands full of foreigners, played a part too. Never again would Britain consider the idea of an outright ban on sex between the races.
So, by the mid-1930s, Britain's mixed-race communities were pretty well established. They'd proved that they could defend themselves and support themselves. And crucially, they'd seen off the threat of those anti-miscegenation laws. In short, they were here to stay.
Britain had played with science and flirted with repression, but thankfully never followed the path chosen by Germany. On the night of January the 30th, 1933, a huge torchlight parade marked the appointment of the new Chancellor, Adolf Hitler. Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, his blueprint for the Third Reich, that race mixing was not only an affront to national identity and culture, but a sin against God. Soon so-called race scientists in Germany, obsessed with the idea of keeping the national bloodline pure, would begin visiting schools and youth clubs in the Rhineland, where many French African troops had been stationed after World War I. For the scientists, the very existence of mixed-race German children threatened to contaminate the Aryan race. The children were identified and then taken to a local hospital where at least 385 of them were secretly sterilized.
You've got eugenics taking this rather sinister route in Germany. That doesn't happen in Britain. We don't have race laws flowing from eugenics. Why is that? Why are we different?
One would like to think it's because we're a much more tolerant society. And clearly Britain has had claims to have a history of liberalism and fighting for human justice. But on the other hand, you know, we have a different relationship to the presence of black peoples because they are a small minority. They weren't seen as kind of threatening to white culture.
There may not have been a threat to white culture, but there were places that were genuinely mixed race. Take Liverpool. In 1939, a young English novelist and playwright arrived in the city. He'd been travelling through the country to take stock of industrial and rural England for a new book. The author's name was J.B. Priestley, and amidst all the paranoia about racial mingling, he found cause for celebration.
In Liverpool, he came across a local primary school. He said all the races of mankind were there, wonderfully mixed. In fact, he described it as being like a miniature League of Nations assembly gone mad. The children, he said, were all shades, with Africa and Asia peeping out of their eyes.
In his book, English Journey, Priestley is clearly moved by what he found in the mixed-race community in Liverpool. His writing helped to create a new vision of Englishness. The tolerance he so admired in Liverpool was in stark contrast to Nazi Germany.
Who are these men in flannels? West Indians, of African descent. They are keener and better cricketers than any except a few teams of European origin. Certainly better than any team of Scotsmen or Dutchmen, for example, who are much closer to the English than they are. So you see, all this Aryan nonsense and race superiority business of Hitler's just isn't true.
When the full extent of the horrors of Hitler's final solution were discovered, the British followers of eugenics were horrified. Our dalliance with race science was suddenly over.
All I know is The Tiger Bay experience taught me what it was to be a true human being. These pseudoscientific studies, measuring the size of our head to see if we had the right intelligence or the brain size or what have you, these were fascist concepts, and it has no bearing on how people come together and live together.
When I started looking at all of this, I thought, like most people, that Britain's mixed-race communities only really began in the late 1940s or so, with the arrival of immigrants from the Caribbean. But in fact, as we've seen, you've got to go back much further to those years before and after the Great War, when some white women, perhaps only a handful at first, allowed their hearts to rule their heads, and in so doing felt the full wrath of so-called respectable society. I've been thinking quite a lot about those women. Just imagine how brave they had to be, and not just brave, but free-spirited and open-minded. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that women like Olive Salaman here in what was Tiger Bay were heroic pioneers of mixed-race Britain.
And because of those women, many mixed-race people grew up with a unique British identity which prospers today.
I've always felt very strongly about my colour, and I've always defended it, and I've never ever pretended I was anything other than half-caste Arab. And I am quite proud of the fact.
I'm an Arab. I can't get away from that. And I'm proud of the fact. So I class myself as an Arab Geordie, really.
Geordie with an Arab heart.
A Geordie with an Arab heart.
Yes.
How lovely.
Yeah, if I had my life to get, you know, honestly, I was so happy, you know, being in a mixed family that, you know, I'd like to do it again.
And what of James Wilson, the Chief Constable of Cardiff, who'd wanted to ban interracial sex and had once described mixed-race children as half-castes with the vicious hereditary taint of their parents? Well, in 1946 he was knighted, but after the horrors of Nazi Germany were made public, he was soon saying something very different about Tiger Bay. He now held it up as a symbol, a good example of racial tolerance.
Which is just as well, because what Sir James Wilson could not have known was that in 2011, his great-granddaughter would marry a man whose mother was half Jamaican.
In the next programme, the right to fight, American GIs, the first kiss, and workplace romance.